Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Bible Ponder for this week. Tonight we're going to be looking at chapter 5 of the Book of Lamentations. This is our fifth and final installment looking at Lamentations. It's a book of poetry in the Old Testament, and there are some interesting elements of Hebrew poetry that we've pulled out as well as some historical things that I think shed light on how we understand Jesus in his own context and the world that he was born into. So the first four chapters of Lamentations are each acrostic poems, meaning that each verse corresponds to a different letter of the Hebrew alphabet, 22 verses for 22 letters, going in order from Aleph down to the end, other than chapter 3, which is 66 verses, 22 times 3. Each verse, or each 3 verses, is a letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So now we're in chapter 5, and although it is 22 verses, it isn't an acrostic, but it still is poetry. It still has all of those same sorts of elements. And along the way, I've kind of read through and I've pulled out a few different bits of historical information or things about the poetry that have been there, and then tried to show us how it can help us understand Jesus and the church in our own context a bit more. And chapter 5 is going to be no different. So I'll go through and read and make a few comments, and then we'll talk a bit about what this could tell us about the world that Jesus inhabited. So chapter 5. Remember, O Lord, what has befallen us. Look and see our disgrace. Our inheritance has been turned over to strangers, our homes to aliens. We have become orphans, fatherless, and our mothers are like widows. We must pay for the water we drink. The wood we get must be bought. With a yoke on our necks, we are hard driven. We are weary. We are given no rest. And this is the same imagery that Jesus uses when he says of himself, "My yoke is easy and my burden is light." This would have been common imagery for a rural society, a farming society that had to live off the land. But for the people of Israel at this time, the yoke was not easy. The yoke is hard driven. They're weary. They have no rest. And so when Jesus comes and says, "My yoke is easy and my burden is light," maybe this was a verse their minds might have gone to, maybe not, but the imagery would have been certainly familiar to them. Verse 6, we have made a pact with Egypt and Assyria to get enough bread. Egypt was their closest ally. We've talked a bit about how Egypt was going to come and help them fight against Babylon. Assyria was almost non-existent at this point, having been taken over by Babylon. But in any case, they're making pacts with foreign governments just to get bread. Verse 7, our ancestors sinned, they are no more, and we bear their iniquities. Slaves rule over us. There is no one to deliver us from their hand. They had prided themselves on having a king. Remember, the whole point of even getting Saul was to have a king like the other nations, and for them to be ruled over and by slaves. This is, the Babylon, they wouldn't send Nebuchadnezzar himself to rule over them, but they would have sent, people that they had designated to rule, slaves to rule over the Israelites. We get bread at the peril of our lives because of the sword in the wilderness. This could be bandits or people out in the wilderness attacking them. Our skin is black as an oven from the scorching heat of famine. Women are raped in Zion, virgins in the towns of Judah. Princes are hung up by their hands. No respect is shown to the elders. Young men are compelled to grind, and boys stagger under loads of wood. And to grind, that would have been grinding grain into flour. And that was a task normally reserved only for the lowest of slaves or women in your household for the time. And also at this point, historically, remember we're in the 500s, the sort of almost industrial millstone with either a donkey or a horse that would walk in a circle tied to a beam that would grind the grain. That isn't invented until later on. So the first evidence we have of that archaeologically is in the 300s BC, and this is 500s BC, so a couple hundred years before that is invented and in use. And so this all would have been done by hand with a basin and a stone. It's grueling. It's really hard work. It takes forever. You have to do it every day because you have to get the flour to make bread. The same with the wood. There's no gas, there's no electricity. Everything is powered by wood and fire to get heat, to cook food, to do everything. And so to do these tasks as the lowest of the low of the tasks. The once proud people of Israel, the proud young men especially, were having to do these, what they saw as very menial tasks. The old men have left the city gate, the young men their music. The joy of our hearts has ceased. Our dancing has been turned to mourning. The crown has fallen from our head. Woe to us, for we have sinned. Because of this our hearts are sick. Because of these things our eyes have grown dim. Because of Mount Zion, which lies desolate, jackals prowl over it. But you, O Lord, reign forever. Your throne endures to all generations. Why have you forgotten us completely? Why have you forsaken us these many days? Restore us to yourself, O Lord, that we may be restored. Renew our days as of old, unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure. So there's some measure of looking forward here at the end, but it's not as hopeful as the end of chapter 4. But you still have that idea that we talked about last week, that God still being in charge, but angry at you, is a more palatable idea than the idea that God does not exist at all, or all your notions about God and the world and the way everything works is just completely and utterly false. They are much quicker to just assume that God is mad at them and punishing them for their sins than they are to just say, oh, well, I guess we were wrong about this whole Yahweh business. I guess he doesn't really exist. Their minds go to this place that God is mad at them, and that's maintains God's supremacy, God's superiority, God's power over everything. But what I really want us to focus on, especially in terms of Jesus, is this idea of what would they have been expecting from a Messiah. Now, not every Jew, especially in the first century, expected the same thing out of the Messiah, or even expected a Messiah to come as a person or an event. We tend to kind of simplify it that way, that there were expectations of the Messiah, because that's largely true. And there was an idea of restoring the kingdom of Israel to power, overthrowing the oppressors. That was definitely in the consciousness. But there wasn't one single idea of who the Messiah would be or what the Messiah would do. But largely what they did expect was a restoration of the kingdom of David, this time when they ruled and their land was plentiful. All of these things that they've been talking about in Lamentations were flipped on their heads. So they had plenty of food. It was plentiful. They had, they didn't have to do all the menial labor. They were in the shade. All of this life that's good. That's what they expect. And it's a very physical thing. But one of the things that this leads us to make a distinction with is we latch onto Jesus' own words when he talks to Pilate and says, my kingdom is not of this earth, or my kingdom is not of this world. And so what the church at times has done is said, well, then it's not a physical kingdom at all. So they expected him to come as a restorer of a nation, a king, a physical warrior, ruler. But instead, it's all spiritual. It's all ethereal. It's all kind of up in the air, and it's all just about your heart and your own salvation. But I don't think that's true either. I think there's definitely a spiritual element to the kingdom that Jesus brings, but there is also a physical element. I think it's a bit of a mistake to assume that just because Jesus isn't a conquering ruler, that the kingdom of God that he brings isn't physical and isn't present in our real lives. I think that succumbs to the idea that the only way to exist in the world is through violence and power. The kingdom that Jesus brings, rather, is distinct from the military conquering king, not in its physical versus non-physical, but in the way in which Jesus's life and kingdom is about love and sacrifice and caring for the poor, caring for the least of these. It's about welcoming the stranger. It's about breaking down boundaries rather than building them up. It's about welcoming people peacefully rather than conquering people through violence. So there is definitely a physicality to Jesus's kingdom, but the physicality is different and contrasted from what they would have expected from a military warrior king, and is instead a peaceful, loving, sacrificial, way of existing in the world, that cares for the least of these, that elevates the status of slaves and women, and makes this world where we are all equal, rather than what the nations do, which is instead rule by force. And so when we're contrasting the expectations of the people for a Messiah versus who Jesus was, we're not necessarily contrasting physical versus spiritual, although there is some element of that Jesus' reign is also about a spiritual way of being, the Holy Spirit coming and God being among us. But it is also about the way in which we live, where nations live through force, through conquest, through colonization and subjugation, and the church exists through self-sacrifice, through love and welcome and hospitality. And so as we're looking then at when Jesus comes, in light of what we've been looking at with the Book of Lamentations, we can see how Jesus would have been so surprising and so confounding to the people of his day. Even 5 centuries on after the Book of Lamentations, they are still mourning their city, they're mourning their way of life, and they're looking for God to do something. And when Jesus comes and says, well, I am God doing something, you can see how he is maybe not exactly what they expect. So that is our journey through the Book of Lamentations. I hope you've enjoyed this, enjoyed a sort of dip away from kind of the New Testament and Paul or the Gospels into something a bit different, looking at poetry and all of those things. If you want to catch up on previous episodes, the previous 4 are all online there in the Bible Ponder playlist or on YouTube in Bible Ponder Lamentations. You can check them all out there, or any of our previous series. So thank you for joining us through Lamentations. I hope you have a good evening. Bye-bye.